an extra long episode, I've broken up the workshop into 3 shorter episodes for you this week. So you'll hear part 1 today, part 2 on Wednesday, and then we'll wrap up everything with a special bonus episode on Friday. Whether you've ever wondered why some writing advice seems to work brilliantly for other writers but leaves you feeling frustrated, or you're simply wanting to understand yourself a little better as a writer, I think you're going to get a lot out of this series. In today's episode, we're laying the foundations. We'll explore what NLP modalities are, why they matter, and how understanding your natural wiring can completely change the way you approach your writing. So grab your cup of liquid gold, settle in, and let's dive into part 1 of this special workshop. If you feel called to write a book, but writer's block, procrastination, and self-doubt keep pulling you from the page, you're not alone, and you're not meant to stay stuck. Hi, I'm Madison Michaels, author and life coach, and I've created this podcast as a creative space grounded in faith and mindset transformations to help you break through your blocks, gain creative clarity, and finally finish the book you're meant to write. So grab your cup of liquid gold and let's write the darn book together. Hello and welcome everyone. I am so glad you're here and for taking the time out of your day to join me for Write to Your Wiring. Today we're talking about something that can completely change the way you understand your writing process. We're looking at your NLP modalities, which is really just a way of saying, how does your mind naturally process ideas, language, emotion, story, and information? Because here's what I want you to know right from the beginning. If you've ever tried a piece of writing advice that seems to work so beautifully for everyone else, but somehow makes you feel more stuck, more frustrated, and even more convinced that perhaps what you're doing is wrong, that doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean that you lack discipline either. What it most likely means is that the advice is simply not built for the way your mind works. Because we all have different doorways into our creativity. And my aim today is to help you recognize your natural doorway into your writing so you can stop fighting your own process and begin working with it. Now, by the end of this session today, I want you to have a much clearer sense of why writing might have felt harder than it needed to, and what you can do differently in your very next writing session to harness how you are naturally wired to write. All right, let's tell you a bit about me. We'll go to the next slide. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Madison Michaels, and I am an award-winning author. I've got 9 books published with another 3 coming out this year and next year, with my new nonfiction book coming out shortly in August. I was very lucky enough to win the 2019 Ruby Award for RWA Australia for the best historical book. And I am also an NLP practitioner and a life coach. And before all of that, I was a sergeant in the police for 18 years. And predominantly, I worked as a senior prosecutor and legal advisor for 13 of those years. And then the last about 4 years, I was working for the Education Training Command, teaching leadership, emergency management, and personality profiling. So it's a bit of a strange bundle, all of that mix, but it really does inform the work I now do with writers, because I help writers to understand themselves and what's going on underneath their words. So we look at the patterns, the resistance, the self-doubt that crops up, and the way that you process ideas and create. We also talk about the way you get pulled away from the page, because after years of writing books myself and working with human behavior in a very real environment, I've learned this, that most writers aren't stuck because they're lazy or they don't want it enough. Most writers are stuck because they don't understand how they are wired to write. And that's the heart of my Write the Darn Book philosophy. I honestly believe that every writer is a vessel for their own story. And sometimes we just have to move out of the way to allow the words to flow through us and onto the page. And when you understand how your mind naturally works, that can become a lot easier for you to do. And so today, that's where we're going to begin with that understanding. Now, we will move to the next slide. All right. So, what I ideally want for you all by the end of this masterclass is for you to understand those four main NLP modalities for writers. So, there's the visual modality, there's auditory, kinesthetic, and auditory digital. You'll begin today to recognize which one or a combination of those feels most natural for you. And you might already have a strong suspicion. Perhaps some of you have even done my writing modality quiz on my website, which is great. And for those of you that have, I've just recently updated it to include the percentages as well. So you can see all of your modality breakdown from your most dominant down to your least. So it's really helpful. And for those of you who haven't done the quiz yet, please feel free to go to madisonmichaels.com/quiz and you can complete the NLP modalities quiz there. Now, once you do that, or as we go through the slides today, some of you are going to absolutely resonate more strongly with some of the different modalities. There'll be some of you in here that think, yes, I absolutely see my story like a movie. And others will think, no, I actually hear dialogue first. And some of you will know that your story is only going to flow once you can feel the emotion in your body. For some of you, you'll feel deeply relieved today when we talk about the need for structure, logic, and clarity for some of you. And then what we're going to do today is we're going to look at how your main modality shapes the way that you actually write and you process information. And we're going to talk about how you imagine, how you draft, and how you revise your work as well. Because once you understand your natural modality, then you can approach writing through a doorway that fits for you instead of for somebody else. Then, what we're going to do is I'm going to leave you with something practical, not just an interesting insight, but a practical adjustment that you can test out in your very next writing session. Because insight is fantastic, but on its own, it's just knowledge. But when you combine insight with action, now that's the key to changing how you show up to the page. All right, so let's have a chat about why does some writing advice work for some writers, but for others it doesn't? Because I'm sure all of you have felt that at one point in time, haven't you? I mean, let's face it, there is so much writing advice out there at the moment, particularly in the last year or two. There's just feed and page and info and bits and pieces after bits and pieces on social media with writing advice and advice for everything practically. So, look, some of it is so well intentioned and it's really helpful for some writers. But for other writers, that same advice can actually cause friction and frustration. And all it is, it's not that there's anything wrong with you if it does cause that friction. It's simply because you might be accessing a different doorway into your writing than whoever's giving that particular piece of advice. And that awareness is actually the key in terms of allowing yourself and your nervous system to feel safe, because that's what we have to do at the end of the day. We approach writing and we have to feel safe in the parameters of doing it. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard all sorts of different advice out there. Some advice says, you know what, just jump in and write. You don't need to outline, you don't need to plot. Other advice says, no, you have to plot, you have to outline down to the littlest detail. Other advice might say, you have to sit and focus for hours and just let the words flow. Another advice says, no, you've got to go out and be in nature or write in cafes or do something else. So there's so much advice out there that often conflicts and it can make us feel internally quite uncomfortable if we don't align with that advice. So I want you to hear this now. The advice itself isn't necessarily wrong. It's just it might not be the right advice for how you are wired to write. So that when we have that knowledge and that information, then it takes away the need for the advice to fit us, and we can take what works for us and we can leave behind what doesn't. Because the problem with advice is when it is treated as universal, a one kind of size all fits everyone type of box, then it can create that real friction in authors. For example, a visual writer might feel completely lost if they're asked to just dive in and write before they can actually picture the scene. An auditory writer might also feel lost if they're told you have to have complete silence. Perhaps they need music. A kinesthetic writer might need movement or emotion or body connection before they can comfortably dive in and write. And if they're told, no, you can't have that, you should just follow this advice, that can feel really jarring. An auditory digital writer might need very clear structure and prompts and an outline before they can actually feel comfortable writing. And if they're told, just sit down and fly by the seat of your pants and write, that can feel really friction filled to an auditory digital writer. So, all of this, when you get advice and you realize, no, that doesn't feel right for me, that is very useful information. Because if a writing process creates resistance, it doesn't automatically mean that you are undisciplined or you can't use it. It just might mean that the advice isn't compatible with where you're currently at and the way your mind is naturally wired to create. And that's such an important distinction because when writers assume that friction means failure, they actually shame themselves and they pull away from the page. That's where writing resistance is very noticeable and it can be really hard to get back into the writing because they start believing perhaps they're not real writers. But when you understand that friction is just information, then you can use that information to get curious about it. You can ask, well, what isn't working here? What does my mind need before the words can flow? What would it look like to work with my wiring instead of against it? And that's where writing begins to feel less like a battle and more like a process that you can actually trust and use. Because honestly, so often we're trying to be the writer that we think we should be, or perhaps the writer that we see other writers being. And we forget that being our own unique and authentic self is exactly what our story needs from us. Because let's face it, there is no one else in this world that can write the story that you can write, the story that's calling to you in your heart. So it's really important that we learn to harness our uniqueness into our writing. And that is what the NLP modalities can actually help us do. It can give us that doorway into what works for us so we can get those words onto the page. All right, so I hear you ask, Madison, what is an NLP modality? Well, an NLP modality is essentially, it stands for Neuro Linguistic Programming, the NLP, and it is the main way that your mind actually processes experiences and ideas and information. It gives us a relationship between your mind, your language, and your patterns of behavior. Now, one of the key ideas in NLP is that we don't all internally represent experience in exactly the same way, nor should we. We are unique, and that's a strength that we do have to harness. Now, some people do process in images, and they're very visual. They think, like a movie in their mind. They see scenes, they see colors, patterns, and pictures. Whereas some other people process in an auditory fashion. So they're drawn to sound and voices and rhythm and tone and dialogue. Some people process in a kinesthetic modality, so they understand through feeling and emotion and sensation and atmosphere and movement. And some process through what we call auditory digital, which is a language of logic and structure, internal self talk, meaning and motivation and analysis. Now, I do want to be very clear here. These are tendencies, they are not boxes. So you don't want to think you're only one thing because generally we're all a combination of different modalities. And you don't want to get locked into one way of writing forever. Most writers are a blend, and you can switch between modalities depending on the project itself, even the scene you're writing, and it could be dependent on the season of life that you're in and your experiences that have led up to this point, and they can change. I'm going to show you later in the slideshow too how you can access different modalities in different stages of your actual writing process too. So that is really useful because that can really help you, particularly with revisions. Now, for example, you might be strongly visual when you're imagining a setting, and you could then be quite auditory leaning when you're actually writing dialogue. You could be kinesthetic when you are feeling your character's emotions and you're writing emotional turning points in your book. And you can be auditory digital when you're revising the structure of your novel or your book. And all of that is completely normal. And in fact, it's so healthy as a writer to be able to access the different modalities when you need to. What we're looking for today, though, it isn't a fixed label. We're looking for your strongest doorway into your writing, that place where your creativity most naturally enters onto the page. And once you know that, you can use it deliberately and you can start there instead of forcing yourself to begin somewhere that feels unnatural. And then once you've started, you can consciously layer in the different modalities to create a richer reading experience for your readers. And that's the whole point of this work. It isn't to narrow you or label you, it is to give you awareness and more access to yourself as a writer. So let's start with our visual writers. Oops, sorry, jumped ahead. So we'll go back. All right, so our visual writers. Now, visual writers often experience story through images. So they see the scene, they see the room, the lighting, the clothing that their characters are wearing, the facial expressions, the landscape, the environment, the movement across space. And for some visual writers, the story arrives almost like a movie in their mind. They might not know all the words yet, but they can see where the characters are standing, they can picture the mood of the setting, and they can sense the shape of the story. And this can be a beautiful strength for visual writers because they often bring strong description and vivid imagery and spatial awareness, and that atmosphere to the page that as a reader can be so captivating. When you read a book and you're drawn into the setting and the imagery, almost like you are there, literally in that space with the characters on the page. And that is so cool for a writer to be able to do. Now, visual writers also might love color and mind maps and sticky notes and Pinterest boards or visual, actual physical boards where you print out physical images and you paste them all on your board to give you that sensory imagery details. So visual aids for visual writers can be really useful to help visual writers see the shape of their book outside of their mind. But here is where visual writers can get stuck. If they can't picture the scene, they might assume that they can't write it. So the page that's blank can feel as though the story might be blank if that image is missing too. So they might struggle to explain ideas in a linear way because for them, It's a whole picture experience rather than a neat sequence of sentences. So, if you are a visual writer, the first thing I want you to know is that needing a picture isn't a flaw at all. It's a doorway for you. So, before you start your next session, instead of forcing yourself straight into sentences on the page, take 1 minute and visualize the scene. Where's your character? What can they see? What's the light doing? What's the strongest image in the scene? You don't need to see everything perfectly. You just need one image strong enough that you can open the doorway into your creativity. And if you're stuck, ask yourself, what do I see here? And the question can be enough to reconnect your mind with your story and to give the words somewhere to come from. Well, my friends, that's where we're going to leave part 1 for today. In the next episode, we will continue diving into the remaining modalities, so stay with me for that one. If you haven't already done the quiz, feel free to head to madisonmichaels.com/quiz and do the NLP modalities quiz. It's free, it's fun, and it's going to give you some insights that you'll be able to correlate with the workshops this week. Until next time, take a moment to reflect on what resonated most for you today, and I'll see you back here in 2 days for part 2. My friend, I hope today's episode gave you exactly what you needed for your writing journey. And if it did, would you take 30 seconds to share it with another writer who's struggling to start or finish their book? And if you're loving the show, I'd be so grateful if you left a quick review. It means the world to me and truly makes my day to know that this podcast is helping you. And as you head back into your week, I hope you feel more supported and connected to your creativity. And remember, you're a vessel for the story. So let the words flow through you and onto the page. All right, I'm off to refill my cup of liquid gold and go and do a little writing of my own. Take care, and I'll meet you back here in the next episode of Write the Darn Book.